Now, the Industrial Revolution is one of those turning points in history in which everything changes. For thousands and thousands and thousands of years, going back to when mankind first started, we achieved all the jobs that we had to do with animal muscle, human muscle, and that was it. So the jobs that we were able to do and the things that we were able to create were very limited. Everything was human powered or animal powered. So, it was a lot of labor to clear land or to construct buildings or anything like that. That's why the pyramids were such a wonder and such a big deal, because something that sophisticated and that complex and that large was created by human and animal muscle alone. So the Industrial Revolution, for the first time in human history, we are working and creating things using machines, using steam power. And this allows us to totally transform how we live, how we work, how we play, how we do everything. So, most people get this idea of the Industrial Revolution as being this, factories were created and this happened and everyone was working in mills. I mean, that was part of it, but the fact of the matter is that this revolutionized our entire lives. So if you look at, you're sitting here listening to this recording right now, and if you look in your room or wherever you are in your classroom, everything that you can see, your pen, the shoes that you're wearing, the desk that you're sitting in, the chair that you're sitting on, the windows that you're looking out, are all a product of industrialization. So those things that you can see right now were made somewhere in a factory, overseas or domestic. So imagine that. If you lived 300 years ago, 400 years ago, everything that you owned or possessed would have been made at home, or would have been made by a neighbor, and that you would have bartered with your neighbor for a product. So you can imagine, if that was the case still today, how much less stuff you would have. You wouldn't have very much of anything. A couple pairs of clothes, maybe a pair of shoes, So your possessions would be very limited. So again, look around you and look at all the stuff we do have and how much we do have and how it's all product of this industrialization that's taking place in the early 1800s. So it's really extraordinary when we look at it and kind of wonder where it all started. Now, industrialization is going to start circa 1750 in Great Britain. And it gets off to a slow start. It's not going to be till the end of that century that we really see, industrialization taking place all over that country. But to understand industrialization and mass-producing goods, we got to look at the cottage industry first. Now, the cottage industry is a term used by historians to talk about a system of production that was set up before industrialization took place. So this is a system that was set up in England and parts of continental Europe in the early 1700s. And basically what it is proto-industrialization. All right, it's a way to get mass amounts of goods from a decent amount of labor, but you want to have a peak production basically. So basically what you would have with the cottage industry, if we just look at it in textiles, all right, cloth being produced, you would have an entrepreneur, a middle-class entrepreneur, upper middle class, with capital, with money. And when you have money, guys, you want to make more money. All right, you want to have your money make more money for you. So what we would do is this entrepreneur would go and buy 100 pounds of wool. Okay, they would buy 100 pounds of wool, and then they would go to women who worked at home, like this lady here in the picture. And they would say to these women, hey, I'll give you 15 pounds of wool if you spin it into cloth in 2 weeks. So the entrepreneur would go to different women who stayed at home. He would give them, 15 pounds of wool, and he'd say, all right, in 2 weeks I'll be back to pick it up, all right? And when I come back to pick it up, I'll pay you. So what we have here is women working in the home, producing a product, and then the entrepreneur coming and picking up the product, and then the entrepreneur would sell the finished product for profit. So this is kind of this proto-industrialization we see in the cottage industry. It's a first step in industrialization. But the key thing here is that work is still being done at home, nowhere else. So the women were still able to make their own schedules, basically, as long as the finished product was done in about 2 weeks or whenever the deadline was. Now, the first country that we're looking at globally to industrialize is Great Britain. Great Britain's the first to industrialize, again, after 1750 to 1800. And right behind Great Britain would be the United States, and then the Low Countries of Europe, northern France, the northwestern part of Germany. But the beginning of it all is Great Britain. Now, you got to look at a couple of the reasons why Great Britain is the first to industrialize. And a big reason for this is that, if we look at Europe in the year 1800, Great Britain has a very stable government. It avoided the revolutions that we see happening after 1789 that spread throughout continental Europe. It avoided, for the most part, the Napoleonic Wars, or at least having the Napoleonic Wars being fought on its soil. It avoided having its government toppled by Napoleon or by revolutions. So it really is truly a stable government that also is a constitutional monarchy. So the British political system is really ahead of all other European political systems at the time. It's more sophisticated, it's more stable. And that's going to be important for, encouraging entrepreneurs to invest in industrial machinery and mills and what have you. Because if you're an entrepreneur, guys, and you have capital, if you have money, and you invest in a factory, and then that factory is taken over by a new regime and nationalized or something, you're not going to want to risk your money in that kind of risky venture. So a stable government really is conducive to industrial growth at this time. Great Britain also at the time has an extensive transportation system. And when I mean that, it basically has a series of rivers and harbors, and if you go anywhere in the UK, in cities like Birmingham, kind of in the interior, you're never really more than 150 miles away from the ocean, getting your goods, your industrial goods to the ocean, or using river systems to then get them to the ocean and then sell them abroad. Because we got to look at it like this, guys. If you produce something in a factory and you invested a lot of money in a factory and you start producing cloth, once it's all produced, now you gotta move it. All right, you gotta get it to market. You gotta ship it. So a transportation system is going to be very crucial here and very important in order to sell your goods. The other one, natural resources. Great Britain possessed a lot of coal fields. Coal is what's going to fuel this early industrialization. And so they had a large domestic source of this coal here. The other thing here is because of the stable government and the democratic kind of government, you're going to have a larger middle class emerging at this time. And it's really going to be the new middle class, the new money, that are going to be the ones that invest mostly in these kinds of industrial ventures. The aristocracy, the old money, wouldn't necessarily want to take that risk, or would have had so much money anyway that they would have found other means of increasing their wealth. But the increasing middle class is really going to be crucial to start off this industrialization process. Now, the work, once we get past the cottage industry phase, is going to move to the mills. Now, a lot of this early industrialization is going to see the textile industry being the main focus here. A lot of these early industrial mills are going to be focused solely on producing cotton cloth or wool cloth. Now, if you produce cotton cloth and wool cloth at home, it's very time consuming. It takes a lot of skill. And so it's no surprise that the first kind of industry to industrialize is the textile industry. Because now we can create these machines, these mechanical machines that can do the repetitive work or the repetitive movement of a woman sewing by hand. These machines can do a stitch over and over again, and much faster. So the first places we see this happening in these earliest mills are going to be near rivers or streams, because they need a source of water, running water, to power these mechanical machines that are in the inside of the mill that are spinning the cloth. So a lot of these earliest factories, if you want to call them that, are by sources of water. Another thing we got to look at this time is how this is changing people's lives. Now, for the first time, during the cottage industry, you were working at home. For hundreds of years before the Industrial Revolution, most people were farmers. You would work on the farm from sunup to sundown, utilizing every ounce of daylight. You probably had to work harder on your farm during harvest time, bringing in the harvest before it, rotted in the field. So you'd be working very intensely during the fall, and then in January, you might not have anything to do, really. The harvest is done. You might have to pickle some vegetables or something, or you didn't really have a lot to do like you did in the fall. So people's workload was more closely linked to the rhythm of the seasons, because they were farmers, and that was more important. And people worked whenever they could, and if they didn't finish the job by harvesting, guys, they were going to suffer. They were going to lose money. So the incentive was there to get it done. It was just at your own pace and more in pace with the seasons. So with the opening of the first mills, you get for the first time in human history the concept of a work day in a work week. All right, the idea that you need to be somewhere at 8 o'clock and you have to stay there for 12 hours. All right, prior to that, it didn't exist. If you worked on a farm as a farmhand, you were asked to be there at dawn, and we'd stay all day until the work was done. In 2 weeks, we won't have any work anymore because the harvest is done. So now we have the first time a work day and a work week. All right, and you guys are really used to this at school. You have to be here at 8. You're done at 3 o'clock. You do it for 5 days a week, and you do it, and you have a weekend, and then you do it all over again. All right, so this is something we're so used to in our minds right now, a work schedule or a school schedule. But again, 300 years ago, that would not be the case at all. So our modern rhythm and way of life is purely a product of industrialization and people moving and working in the mills and having to be there at a certain time. So that's just one of the other revolutionary things here about the Industrial Revolution. Now, one of the major inventions that we get here with the Industrial Revolution, that's very noteworthy, is the steam engine, pictured here on the left. Now we've got James Watt, pictured here on the right, the inventor of the steam engine, a Scotsman. And basically what we have here, guys, is a coal-powered engine, all right? So you'd fire up the coal would heat up water in a boiler under pressure. The pressure would be released, and then it would turn certain turbines and what have you until you got mechanical movement. So the first steam engines were built basically to pump water out of coal shafts, deep coal mines, because you dig down deep enough in these coal mines and they would fill up with water. So they needed a way to pump them out. So they developed the steam engine for that reason. Now, don't get confused about the idea of a steam engine and what that means. Okay, it's not just a steam locomotive that you guys tend to think about when we mention steam engine. The steam engine was used early on here as basically the powerhouse for the factories. So like I mentioned before, the factories had to run on, or the mills at the time had to run on a water wheel. Now we can put a steam engine outside, house it in an engine house, and that steam engine can power the whole mill. So it totally revolutionized where we're getting our energy from. All right, and as I mentioned before in the first slide, totally transforms how we get work done. All right, we can now produce things faster, quicker, lift loads that we couldn't previously lift before. So the steam engine is kind of a benchmark, a marker event in the Industrial Revolution. Now, as I mentioned, the factory system, which originally had to be on a stream, is now could be anywhere thanks to the steam engine. So we get increased mechanization and increased technology being used for these early industrial factories. Now, if you look at the picture here, guys, we see typically, again, women working at these very large mechanical looms, and they would just make sure they wouldn't get, knotted up or tied up. But it would be the steam engine by this point running all the mechanics and the locomotion of these machines. You can see in the background there are belts, like rubber belts, attached to sections that spin around. And then that's further tied to like a crankshaft, and that's tied to the steam engine. So, it's total mechanization of what we're looking at here. Now, a lot of these early mills and factories were pretty rough places. You worked 12-hour days. Oftentimes these workers that were working 12-hour days were inside all day, tending to the machines, and these mills were pretty dusty places because there's a lot of textile work going on. So the air would basically be filled with small particles of cotton dust, and the workers would be inhaling this cotton dust all day, every day, and a lot of them eventually would come down with respiratory ailments like white lung, which could be fatal. So the working conditions weren't very, very good, and oftentimes it was very popular to hire children. The reason for that is children, usually came from families of poor workers, poor working families who needed money. They had these kids. They wanted these kids to go to work. So factory workers would hire children because they could hire them for cheaper, and they would oftentimes have children do jobs that adults couldn't do. Like they would send kids underneath these mechanical looms that you see in the picture here, and they would make them go collect like dust bunnies and stuff like that, like debris that adults couldn't reach underneath the machinery. Now, oftentimes kids would get caught up in the machinery, be killed, so it was very dangerous for these kids. And child labor was a huge problem for this early industrialization. Now, as I already mentioned, like our modern day is a direct result of what took place here. All right, so anything that you own is a result of industrialization. The rhythm of life, the time we keep, everything. So we see a lot of social changes during the Industrial Revolution, kind of transforming into the modern day, which is very important. A few technologies that kind of stand out. There are pretty numerous ones. On the right there, we have one of the earliest steam locomotives that were produced. The first steam locomotive was basically a flat cart that somebody put a steam engine on and then put it on rails, and they could go about 8 to 10 miles per hour, but 8 to 10 miles per hour nonstop between Manchester and Liverpool was pretty good, all right? Because in the old days, before trains, you would have gone by a horse or carriage, and you had to stop, and it wasn't a consistent speed. So, to actually get there nonstop at that speed was pretty incredible. But the earliest rail systems is going to be produced in the UK again, and that's going to totally again transform the industrial landscape. Because now, prior to railroads, guys, the best way to move goods was always water. And societies like the United States and Great Britain in the 1820s, 1810s, spent a lot of money digging out artificial canals. In this country, most famously the Erie Canal. And these canals would have been, rivers that were man-made, and they were only about 4 feet deep. All right, but people would float goods on barges through these canals because it was cheaper, easier than transporting on land. However, you had to be by a river source or a water source. Now with the railroad for the first time, we get any place in the interior can be reached. And that means any place that has factories or what have you now has a market for their goods. So it really helps shape the industrial landscape, and again, helps shape the modern world that we live in. Now, the growth of the cities is something we got to highlight here. Prior to industrialization, a large portion of the population lives in the countryside. You would be a farmer, you'd either own land or you didn't, and you worked on the farm. That was your job. Now with industrialization, you're getting factories and mills being built in small towns. People then are looking for work. Poor people from the countryside that were usually tenant farmers would get the idea, well, I'll go work in a mill, make more money, so I got to move to the city. So you're going to have mass movements of people over a couple of decades from the countryside to new towns that were springing up basically overnight. Most notably in the UK, Manchester. So people would crowd into the cities, and it wasn't planned like a modern day city would have been. Factories just would have been placed in the middle. You would have been in great demand of housing, so you had row houses going up, like in the picture here, which is just cheap housing for industrial workers, and it would just sprawl all over the into the countryside. So we're going to have cities like London, for example, reaching a population of 1 million by 1850. Now, this is the first time that a city in Western Europe had reached the population of 1 million since Rome in the 2nd century AD. So that just goes to show you how long it took the Western world to kind of catch up as far as like urban development goes. It didn't happen until the 1850s. So we have a tremendous amount of growth happening in the cities. But with all this kind of growth, you're going to have obviously some issues. Now, if you look in the picture here, we can see a modern day street, all right? But typically what you had is, in the old days, before they redid this is actually a photograph. In the old days, you would have walked outside your door, and that would have been the street, not a sidewalk. And the street was basically how people got around. You would walk to your job, because you wouldn't have been living far from your factory job. So you would walk through the streets. The streets were oftentimes not even paved. If they were, it was cobblestone. And basically, everyone also treated the streets as if it was, an open sewer. Every kind of waste that you could think of, imaginable, human waste, animal waste, garbage from cooking, oil from cooking, would just get dumped into the street. And it'd be like a little ditch in the middle of the street that would, be on an angle, so everything would run into the middle of the street. And if it didn't rain for a long time, it would gunk up the streets. So walking to work through the streets would be, a disgusting ordeal, being covered in all that crap. But basically, on top of this, you're going to have new diseases of the industrial era start to come out, most notably cholera. Now, cholera started to affect the urban populations in the 1830s and 1840s in some of the industrial towns. And basically, you get cholera from ingesting the virus through drinking water. And it's only passed on usually from fecal matter of infected individuals to other individuals. So basically, the reason you get cholera then at the time would be that your drinking supply was tainted with raw sewage. So that open sewer in the street that was oftentimes the issue would have oftentimes seeped into the groundwater and infect people that way. So the growth that these cities went through had to go through some growing pains. It's not going to be until the late 1800s that you get the idea of a modern day city starting to take place. Areas for green space like parks and recreation and stuff like that. Areas that are set aside for leisure activities. Sewers that are underground. Police officers, fire stations. So all this stuff that we think of municipalities as having started to come about in the late 1800s finally. But it's going to take some time to get there for sure. Now, basically we got to look at the means of production. Now, when we look at the means of production, basically, the means of production is, the factory machinery, the stuff that costs money, the machines, the equipment, the steam engines. Who owns that? All right. So basically, there's a couple of fat cats or bigwigs, people that invested money in the industrialization process that own those tools of production. Now, to run that, you need workers. All right. Oftentimes, with industrialization, these were unskilled workers. So, as a guy that owns the means of production, that owns the factories, you could hire unskilled workers, and then if you didn't like one, or if they showed up late, or they were asking for more money, which was often the case, you could fire them. you could replace them in a couple minutes, because you could go down the street and find another unskilled worker that wants to work for less. So oftentimes you're going to have factory owners kind of keeping the wages low, and workers really couldn't do anything. If you asked for a raise, you're gone. All right, so workers were oftentimes seen as exploited by the people that owned the means of production. All right, so basically, you're going to get the formation of labor unions, especially in the late 1800s. That's kind of going to allow workers to organize. All right, so if one worker goes in and then asks for, a raise, and then they're threatened to be fired, then if you're a part of this union, this workers' union, you would just say, all right, if you fire her, all of us are quitting. All right, and then we're totally going to shut down production, and then you're going to lose money. All right, so labor unions become the bane of existence for the factory owners. So you're going to get oftentimes workers organizing, striking, okay, and protesting outside the factory, and then oftentimes the factory workers would bring in hired, muscle to break it up, force them back into working. So you get a lot of anxiety, animosity between the two camps, and this is really going to change politics for sure, going into the industrial age. So, a lot of these workers were pretty much protesting for higher wages, job security, not working so many long hours, having certain holidays off. So, it's just going to be a struggle for the working man, I guess you could say. So, the unions by the end of the 1800s are going to be seen as the champion of the worker, the champion of the working man. However, by the more conservative, wealthy individual, they're going to be seen as a danger to society, an element of society that's going to bring down society and bring it to anarchy or to socialism. So it's going to be a struggle back and forth for a very long time. Now, industrialization is also going to change politics. What you're going to have forming out of the industrialization process is capitalism, all right? Free market capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, meaning that the government doesn't regulate the free market, okay? The invisible hand of the government. And oftentimes, guys, if we have an unregulated economy, an unregulated market, it could leave a lot of room for monopolies to form. Monopolies snuff out competition, can manipulate prices because of that. And also on top of that, if it's unregulated, you really don't have any rights for the workers, if you would say, really. So there's no rights for the workers, no rights for the consumers in a system that's entirely free market, or at least you'll have a lot of abuses. So a reaction to that is socialism, which is going to be in a different lecture. All right, but I want you to make the connection that, industrialization and the exploitation of the working class is directly results the theories of Karl Marx, pictured here, that good-looking beard, and it's totally going to transform the political landscape of the industrial world. Marxism is going to be a major influential political force in the 20th century. Some would say maybe the most influential. So all this political reaction is a result of industrial exploitation and industrialization in general. So it's an attempt to, bring humanity back to this industrialization that is seen as by some as being inhuman. So it's kind of an interesting kind of take on how it's changing politics. Now, I think the overarching analysis that we can look at here is how society was transformed, how daily life was transformed, how our cities were transformed, how we work was transformed, how we build things, how we produce things was totally transformed, how the family life was transformed, everything in our lives today is a completely direct result, unless you're Amish, of industrialization. So, the next time you're looking at your iPhone or, iPod, if you guys still have those, that would not exist without industrialization or a post-industrial world. So it's kind of a cause and effect thing. So this is one of those time periods in history, guys, or those events in history that is a complete or has a complete transformation on our life. And we are still totally feeling it today.